Spring, 1942. The English countryside still smelled of mud, oil, and fear. Over the gray skies of East Anglia, hundreds of silver bombers roared toward the continent every morning, and fewer came back every night. The young men who flew them learned early that survival wasn't courage, it was luck. At the edge of an airfield near Debden, a British mechanic watched a crippled B-17 limp home on one engine. Its fuselage was torn open, its wings trembling. When it landed, one of the surviving gunners climbed down and said quietly, "We lost 10 men for every bomb we dropped." Nobody argued. Everyone just nodded. Across the North Sea, the Luftwaffe ruled the air. Their Messerschmitts came out of the sun, invisible until it was too late. American bombers tried to defend themselves with machine guns, but against sleek German fighters, they were little more than flying targets. The losses were staggering. In August 1943, during the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, 60 B-17s vanished. 60 planes, each carrying 10 men, gone within hours. The sky over Germany looked like a furnace. At the officers' club that night, someone tried to make a joke. Maybe if we paint "Please don't shoot" on the wings, they'll let us through. No one laughed. The Americans needed a fighter that could protect the bombers all the way to Germany and back. A plane fast enough to catch a Messerschmitt, strong enough to climb above it, and light enough to fly farther than any engine yet could. But in 1942, that idea sounded like fantasy. The U.S. Army Air Forces already had its share of fighters, the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt. Big, heavy, noisy machines that looked impressive but drank fuel faster than they could fly. None of them could escort a bomber beyond the borders of France. The Germans waited over the heart of Europe, and once the bombers crossed the Rhine, they were alone. In London, British officers followed the same news with growing dread. One RAF commander called the American daylight strategy a suicide parade. Others whispered that the Yanks would break before Christmas. And then came the Mustang. When the first P-51s arrived on British soil, they didn't look like much. Slim fuselage, narrow wings, an engine that whined instead of roared. The British pilots who saw them smirked. "A pretty horse for a hopeless race," one of them said. Even the Americans didn't seem convinced. The Allison engine that powered the early models was weak at high altitude. Above 15,000 feet, the Mustang could barely breathe. It was fast and graceful near the ground, but useless where the bombers flew. "Another orphan," an officer muttered during the test flight. "We'll have to send it back to the stables." But among the engineers, there were whispers. The Mustang's design, its laminar flow wing, its aerodynamic balance, was too perfect to waste. It only needed the right heart. Meanwhile, in the skies above Germany, the war turned bloodier by the day. Pilots wrote to their families in pencil, knowing ink would freeze at altitude. Letters home carried the same refrain. "We see the contrails of the Germans before we even see the target." The men of the 8th Air Force began to look like ghosts. They'd wake up at 4 a.m., climb into their heavy suits, and walk across the frost-covered runway in silence. Some carried Lucky Charms, some carried Bibles, some carried nothing at all. A few carved their initials into the walls of the barracks, proof that they had existed in case they didn't come back. At command briefings, the maps of Europe were riddled with red pins, each one marking another mission, another loss. The generals tried to sound confident. The Germans can't keep up forever. But the young pilots had already learned that wars don't wait for logic. Then, in a factory hangar in Los Angeles, a small team of engineers at North American Aviation was working late. Among them was a man named Edgar Schmud, a German-born designer who'd left his homeland years before the Nazis came to power. His creation, the P-51, was supposed to be America's answer to the Luftwaffe. Now it was gathering dust. But Schmud believed in it. Every line of the aircraft, every curve of its wings, had been designed for one thing: efficiency. "The airplane wants to fly," he told a colleague one night. "We just have to let it." Across the ocean, in a cold hangar in England, another engineer ran his hand along the Mustang's sleek nose and muttered, "What if we gave it a real engine?" He was thinking of the Rolls-Royce Merlin, the beating heart of the Spitfire. A machine that could take the Mustang's elegant design and turn it into something lethal. The Americans thought it impossible. Too complex. Too expensive. But the British had learned something the hard way. In war, the impossible often costs less than defeat. For now, the Mustang sat grounded, overlooked, forgotten. On the runways of England, the bombers still lifted off each morning into the gray mist, disappearing one by one into a sky they no longer trusted. At night, when the surviving crews returned, the base would fall silent. The men who made it back would line up in the mess hall, heads bowed, staring at the empty seats that wouldn't be filled tomorrow. Someone once said that air war was a battle of machines. But those who lived through it knew better. It was a battle of endurance, of hope against certainty. And as the spring rains came and washed the runways clean again, an idea was beginning to take shape in the minds of a few restless engineers. All it would take was a different heart and one British engine. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. What if we put a Merlin in it? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Autumn 1942. A rain-soaked airfield in Hucknall, northern England. Two British engineers from Rolls-Royce stood beside an American plane that looked both beautiful and defeated, the P-51 Mustang. Its fuselage gleamed under the low gray sky, but inside, its Allison engine wheezed and coughed like an asthmatic horse. "It's got the body," one of the engineers said, tapping the metal skin with his wrench. But not the soul. The Americans had shipped over a few Mustangs for testing. They'd expected the British to be impressed. Instead, the RAF treated it as a curiosity, fast at low altitude, useless above 15,000 feet. A fine escort for a Sunday picnic, one test pilot joked after his flight. But don't take it near the war. Yet to the men at Rolls-Royce, the problem wasn't the airframe, it was the engine. The Allison was solid, reliable, but it gasped where the German fighters thrived, in thin, frozen air. That's where the Merlin came in, the same power plant that had carried the Spitfire and the Hurricane through the Battle of Britain. It could breathe at 30,000 feet like it was born there. So they did it. Quietly, without official orders, a group of mechanics and test pilots worked after hours in the dim light of the hangar, swapping the American engine for a British one. The fit wasn't perfect. The cowling had to be reshaped, the cooling system redesigned. But they didn't care. They just wanted to see if it could fly. The first test took place on October 13, 1942. A cold wind swept across the runway, bending the grass flat. Test pilot Ronald Harker climbed into the cockpit, closed the canopy, and muttered, "Let's see what you're made of, lad." The Mustang's propeller spun, and the sound that came out wasn't the thin whine of the Allison anymore. It was a deep, steady roar, like something alive. The plane rolled forward, leapt from the tarmac, and climbed. Higher, faster, smoother than anyone had expected. On the ground, the engineers stared at their instruments, speechless. Harker's voice crackled through the radio, climbing like a homesick angel. He leveled off at 20,000 feet, then 25, then 30. The plane didn't falter. It sliced through the clouds like a blade. "She's not just flying," Harker said. "She's dancing." That night, the hangar filled with laughter, cigarettes, and disbelief. The logbook recorded the results in neat handwriting. Performance increase, extraordinary. Speed 437 miles per hour. Altitude capability, exceptional. Someone added in the margin, "This changes everything." But not everyone agreed. When the news reached Washington, the reaction was cautious, even irritated. "We're not in the business of letting the British redesign our fighters," one general said. If the Mustang was meant to have a Merlin, North American would have put one there. Bureaucracy met innovation head-on, and for a time, bureaucracy won. Rolls-Royce could only build a few converted Mustangs for testing. But one of the British officers, Air Vice Marshal Basil Embry, saw the truth. "If this plane goes into production," he said, "it will win the war in the air." In California, North American's chief designer, Edgar Schmud, received word of the experiment. He read the report twice, then a third time, and finally smiled. "So," he said, "they gave her wings she deserved." Within weeks, he ordered his engineers to adapt the airframe to fit the Packard-built version of the Merlin, an American-made copy under license from Rolls-Royce. By early 1943, the P-51B Mustang rolled off the production line, sleek, fast, and now with a heartbeat that could reach Berlin and back. When the first prototypes arrived in England, the pilots could hardly believe it was the same machine. You touch the throttle, one said. And it feels like it knows what you're thinking. At full power, the Mustang screamed past the horizon, leaving behind the familiar drone of heavy engines. It was agile, elegant, but beneath the grace, it carried something feral. It could climb faster than a Spitfire and outrun a Messerschmitt. Test reports from the RAF read like love letters. Climbs like a devil, turns like a dream. At last, we have a fighter that can go to Berlin and come home for tea. Still, many American officers didn't trust it. We've had miracle planes before, one colonel scoffed. They usually end up as scrap. But the war had reached a point where desperation forced courage. The bombers were dying faster than they could be built. The sky over Germany had become a graveyard of aluminum and smoke. When the new Mustangs took off for their first combat escort mission in late 1943, the ground crews watched with a mix of awe and prayer. One mechanic crossed himself and said softly, "Bring them home." Somewhere over the channel, a flight of B-17s moved toward Bremen, and for the first time, their shadows were joined by something faster, quieter, and unmistakably alive. The German radar operators saw it too. Neue Jagdflugzeuge, one shouted, new fighters. Their analysts couldn't identify the type. They called them Langstreckenjäger, the long-range hunters. But to the Americans, it was something simpler. The plane nobody had wanted, reborn as the one everyone needed. In the mess hall that night, a pilot pointed at a newspaper clipping of a Mustang and said, "She's got a British heart and an American soul." Another added, "Then maybe she'll fight like both." Outside, on the cold English runway, the wind howled through the empty sky, a sky that was no longer just Germany's to own. And in a few short months, those Mustangs would lead the bombers all the way to Berlin, and this time, they'd make sure every man came back. The hunters were about to become the hunted. December 1943. The air over England was sharp enough to cut. Across the fogged runways of the 8th Air Force, crews gathered in silence, breath turning white in the cold. On the mission board, one word in chalk, Bremen. For weeks, rumors had whispered through the barracks, talk of a new escort fighter. Most dismissed it. They say that every month, one gunner muttered. But when they reached the flight line, the rumors stood gleaming under floodlights. Rows of silver Mustangs, slender and fast-looking, with black stripes under their wings. "They look too light," someone said. "Maybe light is what'll save us," another replied. At dawn, the bombers rose, heavy, roaring fortresses. Then the Mustangs followed, cutting through the morning haze like blades. The men in the B-17s could hardly believe what they saw, fighters flying beside them, not above or behind. They looked like angels, one crewman later wrote, keeping watch. Over the North Sea, frost crept along the canopies. Then, from the clouds, Messerschmitts. Dozens. For 2 years, this moment had meant slaughter. But this time, before the Germans reached the bombers, the Mustangs turned in duff. They didn't climb, recalled Captain Bill Overstreet. They attacked. Twin lines of tracers slashed the sky. A German fighter exploded into flame. Another spun away, trailing smoke. The rest scattered, breaking formation. For the first time in months, the bombers stayed steady, unbroken. On the ground, German controllers shouted into radios. "Achtung! Neue Jäger! Sie sind zu schnell." New fighters. They're too fast. The reports that followed stunned the Luftwaffe command. These weren't the short-legged thunderbolts they'd faced before. These new planes could stay with the bombers all the way to Germany and back. By noon, the sky above Bremen was chaos. Explosions bloomed across the clouds. Engines screamed. But when the bombers turned home, something unthinkable happened. They came back, all of them. At debrief, an officer stared at the casualty board. "There must be an error," he said quietly. "Not one group lost." "No, sir," came the reply. "They're all accounted for." The hangar erupted. Mechanics hugged pilots, laughed, cried. Someone ran a hand over a Mustang's fuselage, whispering, "You're beautiful, you deadly thing." That night, intercepted German transmissions confirmed what every man already felt. The balance of the air war had shifted. For the first time, the sky over Europe wasn't owned by the enemy. But victory didn't feel like triumph, more like disbelief. Lieutenant Robert Rosenthal wrote in his logbook, "We kept waiting for the next wave, for the ambush that never came. The silence on the way home was the loudest thing I've ever heard." In the following weeks, the Mustangs flew deeper into occupied territory. Their reach stretched across the continent, from the Dutch coast to the industrial heart of Germany. They escorted every bombing run, fought off every interception. The German aces who once hunted at will now found themselves hunted. They painted names on their Mustangs. Old Crow, Big Beautiful Doll, the Flying Undertaker. To the Germans, they were nightmares. To the Americans, salvation. Each mission rewrote the rhythm of the war. Bombers out at dawn, Mustangs circling above like hawks, the enemy retreating into the haze. And for the first time, those who took off in the morning had reason to believe they might see sunset. In March 1944, the first Mustangs reached Berlin. It was the moment no one had dared to imagine. American fighters over the Nazi capital. German commanders radioed frantic orders: intercept, destroy, stop them. But the Mustangs didn't stop. They chased their enemies down to the ground. In briefing rooms back in England, generals spoke in quiet awe. "Gentlemen," one said, pointing at a map covered in pins, "the air war is ours." Yet for the men in the cockpits, the feeling was different. Not glory, but relief. They'd flown through years of fear and loss. Now, finally, the tide had turned. Still, in the cold barracks after each mission, the same question hung in the air. If this machine could change the war in the skies, who would change it on the ground? The answer was already forming. Somewhere across the channel, in the dark waters where the next invasion was being planned. And soon, those same pilots who had conquered the air would find themselves guarding something even greater. The men who would fight to take Europe back. Winter, 1944. The cold rolled across England like steel. In briefing rooms lined with cigarette smoke and maps of Europe, officers stared at a red circle drawn deep inside enemy territory. Berlin, the heart of the Reich. No American bomber group had ever gone that far and lived to tell about it. The order was simple: reach Berlin, drop, return. But everyone knew it was madness. "That's a one-way ticket," muttered one navigator. Even the generals hesitated. The range was too great, the flak too thick, the Luftwaffe still too strong. But then a colonel pointed to a new mark on the mission plan. P-51 Mustangs with Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. "They'll go the distance," he said. "This time, we'll have eyes all the way home." The crews prepared in silence. In the half-light before dawn, frost coated the bombers like armor. The pilots rubbed their hands together, breathing clouds into the cold. Each man knew the odds. No one said them out loud. At 0600 hours, the engines began to roar, hundreds of them, shaking the frozen ground. The B-17s lumbered into the sky, one by one, until the horizon looked like a swarm of steel bees. Above them, cutting through the rising sun, came the Mustangs. Sleek, fast, confident. They looked like they belonged to another world, a tailgunner later wrote. By the time the formation reached the coast, the weather had turned. Wind and snow, visibility near zero. Over the radio, static hissed and voices cracked. "Keep formation, don't break." But even through the storm, the pilots could see faint flashes ahead, the first German interceptors diving out of the clouds. Luftwaffe aces, men with hundreds of kills, came screaming down in perfect formation. "There they are," someone muttered. The real welcome committee. The first wave hit hard. Focke-Wulfs dove straight for the bombers, cannons blazing. But then the Mustangs answered. They dropped out of the clouds like hawks from heaven, cutting through the enemy with impossible precision. "I'd never seen anything move like that," wrote Captain Jack Ilfrey. "She climbed faster than the Spitfire, turned tighter than a 109, and hit like a hammer." The Germans tried to adapt, diving, looping, climbing, but the Mustangs were everywhere. The sky turned into a dance of death. Below, the bomber crews watched the tracers arc across the gray sky. "The horizon was just fire," said one pilot. And somewhere under that fire, Berlin. Hours passed. The formation kept moving east, deeper into Germany than any American airman had ever gone. Cities turned to ash beneath them. Rail yards burned like dying suns. And yet, the Mustangs never left. They circled above, patient and relentless, striking at anything that rose from the smoke. One German prisoner, interrogated later, described what it felt like. "You looked up, and the sky was American." By late afternoon, they reached the target. The bomb bays opened. The sound was unlike anything on Earth. Thousands of pounds of steel tumbling into a city already on fire. And then, the black smoke of Berlin rose to meet them. Flak erupted from the ground. Walls of explosions so close they rattled teeth. A Mustang's wing was torn clean off. Another spiraled into the clouds. "I saw him go," wrote Lieutenant Don Gentile. "He didn't bail. He wrote it down." But most didn't fall. Most kept flying. Through smoke, through chaos, through hell itself. When the last bombs dropped, the radio came alive. 8th Air Force, turning west. No one cheered. They were too exhausted, too stunned to believe they'd made it that far. The flight back felt endless. Engines coughed. Fuel ran low. The men counted every minute. And then, as they crossed the channel, sunlight broke through the haze. In England, crews rushed to the runways as black dots appeared on the horizon. First a few, then dozens, then hundreds. The sky filled with returning planes. "They're coming back," someone shouted. God, they're actually coming back. That night, over lukewarm coffee in the mess hall, a general pinned a map to the wall. The line from England to Berlin stretched like a scar across Europe. "We reached the heart," he said quietly, "and we came home." But for the pilots, it was more than strategy. It was something personal. Berlin wasn't just a city. It was the symbol of every friend who hadn't returned. Every empty bunk, every burned-out fuselage left in a French field. "We weren't bombing buildings," one Mustang pilot said years later. "We were burying ghosts." In the cold stillness after the raid, the men of the 8th Air Force gathered outside their barracks, looking up at the night sky. No one spoke. The smoke from Berlin still drifted in the east, invisible but real. For the first time, they'd flown to the edge of death and come back. And yet, as the fires of the Reich burned below them, every man felt the same truth settle heavy in his chest. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the reckoning. And far above the frozen clouds, where the last contrails glowed red against the sunset, the Mustangs kept circling, guarding the bombers, guarding the sky, as if to say, "We'll see it through." All the way to the last mile. March 1944. The winter fog over Germany had begun to thin, revealing a sky that belonged to no one and to everyone. At 20,000 feet, men fought for it every day. The Luftwaffe called them the Eighth Devils. The Americans called themselves survivors, at least the ones still flying. On the morning of March 8th, Captain John Red Norwood pulled on his gloves, still damp with oil, and looked at the nose of his P-51 Mustang. Someone had painted the words "Sweet Revenge" across the cowling. Below it, 6 black crosses, each one a German fighter he'd shot down. He didn't smile when he looked at them anymore. The briefing was short and brutal. Target, Hanover. Heavy Luftwaffe presence. Expect intercept. The men already knew what that meant. Once they crossed the Rhine, there would be no turning back. By the time they reached the target area, the radio chatter had thinned to clipped sentences. Bandits, 3 o'clock high. Then, silence. They came out of the sun. FW-190s, sleek and deadly, diving with the precision of hawks. The first pass shredded a B-17's wing. The bomber spun downward, engines screaming. Then the Mustangs were there. From the ground, it must have looked like a storm. Silver flashes darting through black clouds, trails of smoke crisscrossing the sky. Over the radio, Achtung, Schwarm 5, attack from the sun. Neen, they're already behind us. Red rolled into a dive, pressed against his seat as the Mustang screamed. A Messerschmitt shot past him, guns blazing, but Red's aircraft held, the Merlin engine roaring in his ears. "She screamed like a banshee," he wrote later. And I realized she wasn't afraid to die. The fight lasted nearly 40 minutes. It felt like hours. The Germans fought with desperation, their skill unmatched, but the tide was turning. The Luftwaffe was bleeding. The Americans had learned every trick, every maneuver. The difference now wasn't the machine, it was the man behind it. High above the smoke, ace against ace, the duels became personal. One German, maybe Erich Hartmann himself, broke from formation to engage a single Mustang. They spiraled through the clouds, diving and climbing, engines howling, until the Germans' cannon jammed. He peeled away, alive but beaten. Later that day, another pilot, Lieutenant Ben Drew, scored 2 kills in 1 pass. He returned to base pale and shaking. When the ground crew cheered, He just stared at his hands. "It doesn't feel like winning," he said softly. "It feels like surviving." Each battle carved away another piece of both sides. For every German ace lost, a dozen young pilots took his place, boys barely trained, sent to die in machines they could barely control. The Americans saw it happening and felt no joy. They were still good, one Mustang pilot recalled. Just fewer every time. By April, the air war had become a grim routine. Take off before dawn, climb through the clouds, meet the enemy, and come home, if you could. The men stopped keeping count of their victories. The scoreboard on the fuselage no longer mattered. The only number that did was how many planes returned. Intelligence reports told the story. German fuel supplies were collapsing. Aircraft factories were burning. Airfields lay in ruins. But the cost was visible too. Twisted metal in English fields, empty bunks in the barracks. Still, something inside the Luftwaffe was breaking. One American pilot wrote home, "You can feel it. They fight like men who know it's ending." During one mission over Leipzig, the radio picked up a strange sound, a German pilot's last transmission. His words were calm, almost peaceful. "For Michigan ist der Himmel still." For me, the sky is quiet now. Seconds later, his plane vanished into the clouds. The Americans didn't celebrate. The sky had become too heavy for that. And yet, through the exhaustion and smoke, there was one clear truth. The war in the air had shifted forever. For the first time, Allied bombers reached every corner of the Reich. For the first time, the Luftwaffe could not stop them. The Mustangs had done what no one believed possible. They had cut the wings off Germany itself. By summer, the German Air Command was in ruins. Entire squadrons grounded for lack of fuel. The once untouchable aces, scattered, captured, or dead. The same pilots who once called the Americans rookies now fled at the sight of the silver fighters. But victory carried its own weight. Red Norwood's logbook ends with one final entry, written in shaky pencil. "Berlin's next. We'll go again. We always go again. But I don't think any of us are coming back the same." That night, as the men cleaned their pistols and wiped oil from their faces, they could hear the hum of engines in the distance. Another squadron taking off into the darkness. They didn't look up. They just listened. And somewhere over the clouds, above the thunder of their engines, the last of the Luftwaffe still waited, defiant, desperate, dying, for a fight they could no longer win. By the time summer came, Berlin would lie exposed beneath them. But before that final mission, the men who conquered the skies would learn one more lesson. Victory, like flight, always comes with a fall. March 6, 1944. The morning sky over England was steel gray, the kind that swallowed sound and light alike. Across the airfields of the 8th Air Force, men stood by their planes in silence. Someone muttered, "Berlin. They're sending us to Berlin." Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke after that. At 7 o'clock, the roar of engines shattered the stillness. Hundreds of B-17 flying fortresses began to rise, their wings glinting in the weak sun. Each one carried 10 men and tons of bombs, and the unspoken truth that most might not return. Above them, climbing higher, the Mustangs took their positions, 72 sleek P-51s, their polished fuselages flashing like silver blades. From the ground, it looked like an endless river of metal pouring east. Over the channel, the contrails spread into white scars that stretched toward the horizon, toward the heart of the Reich. For 2 years, the Germans had believed Berlin was untouchable. They called it the fortress in the clouds. Every time the Americans had tried to reach it, they'd been torn apart before they even saw the city. But now, with the Mustangs leading them, the bombers would go farther than ever before. Captain Joe Peters, flying lead Mustang, radioed to his squadron, "Stay tight. Stay high. No one goes home alone." His voice was steady, but his hand trembled as he pulled back on the throttle. The engines screamed as the Mustangs climbed to 30,000 feet. Hours passed. Over the radio came the first call, "Flak ahead." Heavy. Black clouds erupted across the sky, German anti-aircraft fire, precise and merciless. A B-17 exploded in midair, vanishing into fragments of smoke and aluminum. The rest kept flying. Then came the words everyone dreaded. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Dozens of Messerschmitts rose from the horizon, black silhouettes cutting through the sun. They dived in tight formation, confident. almost ritualistic. For years, they had ruled this sky, but the rules had changed. The Mustangs broke formation and charged. The first clash was pure chaos, tracers slicing through the clouds, engines screaming, radios bursting with shouts and static. "They're all over us. He's on my tail. Brake left." Joe saw a Messerschmitt lining up on a bomber's tail and dove without thinking. The world spun, sky, earth, fire. Then he squeezed the trigger. 2 short bursts. The German fighter burst into flames, tumbling into the cloud bank below. "Good kill, lead," came the voice over the radio. But Joe didn't feel anything. Everywhere, the same story played out. Man against man, machine against machine. German aces fought with desperate brilliance. Some refused to bail out even as their planes burned, diving straight into the earth. The Mustangs didn't chase glory. They chased survival. And above it all, the bombers kept moving, slow, steady, unstoppable. By noon, the city appeared below them, a vast sea of smoke and ruins. Even from 25,000 feet, Berlin looked wounded. The pilots could see the scars of earlier raids, the blackened factories, the collapsed rail yards. But still, the city lived. "Target in sight," came the voice over the intercom. "Open bomb bays." The sound that followed was like thunder breaking the sky. Bomb after bomb fell, spinning through the haze. From above, it looked almost silent, tiny black dots disappearing into the white. Seconds later, the earth below bloomed with fire. From the ground, Berliners watched in disbelief. It wasn't just the bombs. It was the fact that the American bombers were flying in daylight, in perfect formation, as if daring anyone to stop them. "They came like gods," one survivor later said, and the sky burned with their anger. The anti-aircraft guns fired until the barrels glowed red. The Luftwaffe scrambled every fighter it had left, but there weren't enough. The Mustangs met them before they could reach the bombers, turning the air over Berlin into a storm of smoke and metal. A German pilot's final transmission, intercepted by Allied monitors, was calm and strange. "They are everywhere. We cannot see the sky anymore." Hours later, when the last bomber cleared German airspace, Joe finally spoke into the radio. "All units, check in." Voices crackled back, one by one, counting off. Then silence. Too many missing. Too many never answered. When they landed in England, the men didn't cheer. They didn't even speak. Ground crews rushed to the planes, helping the pilots out, some too numb to stand. Joe climbed down from his Mustang, removed his gloves, and stared at the streaks of soot on the fuselage. "We flew to Berlin," he said softly, "and came back. For the first time, all of us." That night, reports poured into Allied command. Berlin had been hit harder than ever before. Not one bomber lost to enemy fighters. The impossible had become real. But as the men sat in the mess hall, eating in silence, no one smiled. The victory felt too heavy, too fragile. They had reached the heart of the war and found no triumph there, only ruin. One mechanic, wiping oil from his hands, said quietly, "We've won the sky." Then, after a pause, he added, "But God help us for what we've done with it." Outside, the wind howled across the dark airfield. In the distance, another squadron was already warming their engines for tomorrow's mission. The same sky, the same ghosts. And though the war had turned at last, for the men in those cockpits, it was no longer about victory. It was about endurance. The sky over Berlin was theirs now, but it had taken everything to claim it. The hangar smelled of oil and dust. 40 years had passed, but when the old men gathered there, it might as well have been 1944 again. Outside, the summer air shimmered above the runway, and someone had rolled a polished P-51 Mustang into the sunlight. Its wings gleamed like a mirror. The sound of its engine warming up, that low, rising growl, made every man in the crowd stop talking. "The Germans stopped laughing," said one voice, rough and tired. "But by then, we'd stopped smiling too." The speaker was Colonel Joe Peters, gray-haired now, his hands shaking slightly as he adjusted his veteran's cap. Around him were other men, some with canes, some in wheelchairs, all wearing the same small silver wings on their jackets. They weren't heroes anymore, not in the way people thought. They were survivors, and that was harder to carry. Inside the museum hangar, there was a display case filled with medals, photographs, and logbooks. One of the pages showed neat handwriting, faded with time. March 6, 1944, Berlin. 6 hours 40 minutes. Returned. Below it, a note scribbled in pencil. All of us came home today. Joe ran his fingers along the glass. We were kids, he murmured. We thought courage meant flying higher. But it meant coming back. The reunion was small, fewer men every year. They traded stories over lukewarm coffee, laughing too loud, then falling silent at the same moments. No one spoke about fear. No one had to. They all knew the sound of it. The engines sputtering at altitude, the rattle of flak, the voice on the radio that never answered again. Outside, the P-51's propeller turned faster. The mechanic at the controls revved the engine, and that sound, that deep, rolling thunder, filled the airfield. The veterans looked up instinctively, as if waiting for orders. The P-51 wasn't just a plane, Joe said quietly. It was our redemption and our burden. He remembered the faces of the German pilots they'd fought. Not enemies anymore, just men. Most of them never had a choice. Neither did he. He'd read somewhere that one of the Luftwaffe aces he'd faced, perhaps even the one he'd shot down over Hanover, had survived the war and become a teacher. That thought stayed with him. A few years earlier, Joe had met a German veteran at an airshow in Texas. The man was in his 80s, frail, with eyes as pale as smoke. They'd shaken hands beneath the wing of a restored Mustang. We both loved the sky, the German had said. It just took a war to learn it. They'd stood there for a long moment, listening to the engine idle. Two men who had once tried to kill each other, now bound by something that neither could explain. For the pilots of the 8th Air Force, the end of the war had not brought peace, only silence. The nightmares had followed them home. The sound of engines stalling, the smell of burning fuel, the feeling of falling through empty air. Wives learned to touch them gently when they woke screaming. Children learned not to ask about the metals in the attic. Yet somehow, through all of it, the Mustang had remained a symbol of something purer. Grace, precision, freedom. When Joe flew one again, just once, in his 60s, he said it felt like coming home. The stick's light, he told his grandson afterward. You don't fight her. You trust her, and she trusts you back. As the veterans watched the plane taxi toward the runway, someone started to clap. Slowly, awkwardly, others joined in. The pilot, a young man barely 30, saluted through the canopy. The Mustang rolled forward, the engine rising to a roar that shook the air. Then it leapt from the ground, nose up, wings catching the light. For a moment, the sound was deafening. Then it was just wind. Joe followed the silver shape until it disappeared into the clouds. That's what we fought for, he said softly. Not revenge, not medals, just that sound and the freedom behind it. The crowd lingered long after the plane was gone. A few men stood alone by the runway, staring at the sky. Others drifted back into the hangar, where the smell of oil mixed with the faint scent of rain. A museum guide turned off the lights over the exhibits, leaving only the glow on the Mustang's polished nose. Its reflection caught the last rays of daylight, like the memory of a flame refusing to die. In the quiet, Joe placed his hand on the metal frame of the aircraft. It was warm, alive, as if the machine itself remembered. You gave us back the sky, he whispered. He stayed there until the lights dimmed completely, listening to the echoes of engines long gone, the hum that had followed him all his life. Somewhere in that sound were the voices of friends, laughter in the radio static, the rush of air before the dive. When he finally turned to leave, he looked back one last time. The plane stood motionless in the half-dark, beautiful and still. Outside, the night air was cool. The field was empty, the sky vast and quiet. Somewhere above, invisible in the dark, another Mustang might have been flying still, or maybe it was just the wind. Either way, the sound was the same. Because for the men who once owned the sky, the war never truly ended. It only faded into memory, carried on the hum of a propeller, the whisper of air over wings. The P-51 Mustang didn't just win the war. It gave the sky back to those who needed it most, and taught them that even the loudest power can fly silent, steady, and free. And when the hangar doors finally closed, the last thing left in the dark was the echo of flight, soft, endless, and true.